Title of the panel is Social Cohesion and an Established Yet Tolerant National Identity, Assessing Ukraine's Progress or Regression. And I think everybody understands that a country is stronger when the citizenry feels patriotism, when they identify with the government. A country is stronger when there's social cohesion, when there's a sense of community and commonality among its citizens. So I think that's an apt subject for discussion. The issues Walter laid out to consider are stable interfaith and class relations, manageable regional differences, a sense of common history and common future, and ability to assimilate the other. Now, these are questions that are actually common to new countries. You could have asked the same questions when the various German states united in the 19th century and had to overcome these regional differences, even language differences. Ukraine, of course, is a unique situation, and I'm especially happy to have such a strong panel that Walter's put together. And congratulations to all the organizers of the conference, of course. I always learn something every year listening to those that hold forth. I'll give a brief introduction to the three panelists who will speak in the order they're listed on the program and the order in which I'll introduce them, and I'll save some comments I have to the end. Alexander Motyl is a professor of political science at Rutgers. He's formerly an associate director of the Harriman Institute. He's a man with a long list of books and journal articles, and I know has written about the questions of different Ukrainian culture in the East versus the West, among many other topics. Adrian Karatnycky is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council now. He was longtime director of Freedom House and a longtime activist on behalf of Ukrainian issues, going back almost as to the time when he and Walter were in college and after. Roman Waschuk is currently the chair of the Ukrainian World Congress's Foreign Policy Commission and served recently 5 years as Canada's ambassador to Ukraine. So strong panel, and we'll begin with Alexander.
Thank you. So I'll focus on social cohesion first, and I'll talk about the national identity issue. And then towards the end, or at least at the very end, I'll talk about those 4 criteria that Walter raised and mentioned in his in the instructions that we got. And I promised to do this in 12 to 14 minutes, perhaps even earlier. When it comes to social cohesion, again, sense of community, sense of solidarity, the degree to which regions, classes, faiths, and so on are more or less coherently related to one another and aren't perhaps at odds, then the points that I would like to emphasize are the following. It is still the case that the majority of Ukrainians support Volodymyr Zelensky. That may not be a good thing in terms of reform. There may not be a good thing in terms of security and other things, but in terms of social cohesion, it does suggest that there is some kind of general consensus amongst somewhere between 50 to 60 to 70% of the population on his desirability, his trustability, if there is such a term, and so on. There is also, I was recently looking at a survey done, it was published by Yi magazine in Lviv, that suggested that something like 70% of Ukrainians have political values that can be labeled with the shorthand as being left authoritarian, which makes sense, at least. I mean, based on my impressionistic reading of much of the society, that's not inaccurate. Again, that might not be good for reform. That might not be good for the introduction of market reforms, especially. It may ultimately be deleterious for democracy and things like that. But that said, 60 to 70% is a significant portion of the population that doesn't seem to share certain political values. At the same time, as you know, and I believe this was mentioned in the previous panel, a recent poll has shown that support for European Union membership and NATO membership is somewhere in the mid to high 40s. Again, a plurality, if not quite a majority, but one that far exceeds the alternatives, which is to say joining up with Russia, joining up with the Eurasian Union, or simply standing on one's own to the side. All these issues seem to suggest that there is a certain kind of general consensus within the country. Now, of course, and one more point. One more point is that there's been a noticeable migration of parishes from the Moscow Patriarchate to the new Kiev Patriarchate. Now, that was far more rapid and far more extensive a year ago under Poroshenko, and it's slowed down. It's only been several hundred in the last year as opposed to close to 1,000 or thereabouts beforehand. But there again, there seems to be a gradual kind of osmosis, a process of osmosis, by means of which Ukrainians in general expressing a certain preference for a common faith, one that happens to be indigenous to their own country. And then there's COVID. And I'm frankly not sure how to categorize it. I think it's both good and bad. On the one hand, you know, it may be the case, I haven't seen any data to this effect, it may be the case that it's creating a sense of solidarity amongst victims. We are all victims of COVID. On the other hand, as we know from the European and American examples, it's not necessarily true that we're all in this together. Some of us are. Some of us are in our dachas in the Hamptons. And the fact that we're in our dachas in the Hamptons doesn't escape the attention of people who are not in the dachas in the Hamptons. So I think COVID, again, I'm assuming that, I'm basing this on the experience of COVID in this country and Europe, I'm assuming it has divergent, as it were, potential impacts on Ukraine. On the other hand, the COVID-induced economic decline, and in Ukraine, the GDP, is projected to decline somewhere between 4 to 8 to 9%. No one knows for sure. Let's just say it's large. Well, we can be pretty sure that that is not good for social cohesion. These sorts of things not only make people desperate, but they also exacerbate social differences. They exacerbate class relations. There's no question about that. They may also exacerbate ethnic and racial relations as well, certainly in this country, and I'm assuming by extension in Ukraine as well. There's been one final aspect I'd like to mention in this particular context, and that is that while it is true that on the one hand, Volodymyr Zelensky has maintained a remarkable degree of popularity amongst the population in general, it is also true that the extent of support for his party has declined significantly. It was in the upper 60s, lower 70s, now it's somewhere in the 20s, which means that there's a general disillusionment with the political class in general. Surprise, surprise, none of this is terribly unusual in the case of Ukraine. But nevertheless, it does suggest that some kind of fragmentation within political attitudes is also taking place. And then the last point I'd like to mention within this cluster of issues is the fact that many of the moves made by Zelensky, despite his general popularity, and many of the moves made by his minions, either people who are in the office of the administration or supporters within the Servant of the People Party, have led to significant degrees of outrage on the part of significant portions of the population. It's usually been the patriotically inclined population that's been taken to the streets. But as you know, even today, Poroshenko is facing trial, and several thousand people came out in support. And the rhetoric is clearly one of outrage, but it's also fairly inflammatory. Whether or not this will lead to new and further demonstrations, we don't know. But it really suggests that there's at least a significant politically significant, if not numerically significant portion of the population that it takes some umbrage at the policy initiatives, or at least at the suggestions of policy initiatives made by people within Zelensky's camp. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of things that fall on the one hand, and there are several important issues that fall on the other hand. And I'll try to see if I can come up with some kind of assessment of what this all means toward the end. Well, let me now move on to the second bit, and that is the question of establishing a tolerant national identity. First of all, national identity, and secondly, a tolerant national identity. And there I think again, in some contrast to the first issue regarding social cohesion, where there was, let's say, a more or less equal amount of good news and bad news, it seems to me that with regard to national identity, the news is largely goodish. That is to say, not exhilaratingly great, but it's not bad. It's not bad. So some of the things I'd like to mention. Well, one of them I already mentioned is that you do have support for NATO and EU amongst 40+% of the population, which is significant, and suggests that there is, the notion of a Ukrainian nation that is going to be Western oriented and will at least adhere formally, if not informally, to certain democratic and liberal standards seems to be taking root in at least some portion of the population, and that's good. The monument controversy, which was tearing Ukraine apart in the last few years, that's pretty much died down, partly because they've all been torn down, and the street names and the city names have been replaced. But the point is, if there were genuine, deep opposition, and if this really mattered to people, one might expect that to continue, and it's not. I mean, bits and pieces here and there, but it's not significant in any sense of the term. Despite the fact that certain minions of Zelensky and Zelensky himself have expressed some doubts about the language law, excuse me, the majority of the Ukrainian population, the numbers I believe are in the upper 60s, does support Ukrainian as the state language. And if you look closely at the law itself, it's actually pretty reasonable by West European and North American standards. It doesn't deviate in any significant way from the linguistic norms that have been adopted by most democracies, certainly in North America and Western Europe, and arguably in other parts of the world as well. It seems to me that, and here I may be treading on thin ice, but it seems to me that even Zelensky, despite some stupid remarks, or maybe not stupid, perhaps they're just unconsidered remarks about identity and language, but in general, I'd say that he's been pretty positive in the way he presents himself. As I said, I'm trying to make a distinction between Zelensky, the guy, the man who makes statements. And by the way, the statements he makes are almost invariably in Ukrainian. He continually refers to the importance of the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian state, and Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian sovereignty, and things of that sort. I don't know whether he personally believes in all that. As some people say, he may have a kind of Soviet, post-Soviet mentality that borders on little Russianism. And if you look at his earlier career as a comedian, there's ample evidence for that. I suspect that he's beginning to appreciate that presidents of countries have to at least verbally support the existence of their countries, if only because that's the precondition of his being a president. We saw that with Kravchuk, we saw that with Kuchma, we saw that with a whole bunch of post-Soviet leaders in the early 1990s who adopted the mantle of nationalism and national identity, even though they had spent most of their lives fighting those very same nations as apparatchiki within the Soviet Communist Party. On the other hand, as we know, several of Zelensky's minions, one individual stands out in particular, a guy by the name of Brzezinski, have been actively in the forefront of trying to revise the language law, have also making suggestions regarding education, culture, language, and things of that sort. which suggests that certainly they have an agenda that is at odds at a consolidated national identity. But whether that's also Zelensky's agenda, who knows? At this point, it's at least an open question. But the most important thing, I think, leading to the consolidation of a Ukrainian national identity is not so much Zelensky or anti-Zelensky, Poroshenko, or any of these people. It is, quite frankly, and those of you who know me will recall my having made this point ad nauseum in many other fora, and that is Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the war in Donbass. These are consolidating factors. I mean, they are also bad for security, but that's a different set of issues that we might want, that have already been discussed. They may be bad for the economy, but in terms of national identity, even creating something in the nature of an other who is outside the boundaries of the political nation, then Putin has been extremely accommodating. And in that sense, even the fact that he's distributing up to 1 million passports and thereby potentially removing the Donbass from Ukraine's political future, again, that may be bad for the Ukrainian state in terms of its sovereignty. It may affect Ukrainian security, but it's a wonderful way of reinforcing a sense of us versus them, while at the same time submerging that very same sense of us versus them vis-a-vis minorities, ethnic minorities or religious minorities within Ukraine. And what strikes me is that within the last year or so, I don't recall any major conflagrations or conflicts or tensions between ethnic Ukrainians and Jews, and Ukrainian Jews or Ukrainian Poles or Ukrainian Hungarians or Ukrainian Ruthenians. I mean, again, there are some issues and some problems, but by and large, things are fairly stable. So as you can see, it seems to me that in terms of national identity, the picture is not necessarily all wine and roses, but rather somewhat more positive than it is negative, and one could actually speak of a certain degree of progress. Let me end on the following point. Namely, Walter raised those 4 issues which we should discuss, and so stable interfaith relations, I'd say pretty much so. I don't see any deep signs of instability, and arguably there's been some progress here as well. Stable class relations, there, as I suggested, it seems to me that both COVID as well, and especially the economic crisis, will undermine, at least to some degree, the stability of existing class relations. Regional differences, I don't think they've become exacerbated. They may have reduced, they may simply be stable, but I don't see any bad news with regard to that. Is there a sense of a common history and future? My sense is that the answer to that is a qualified yes. There's a qualified increasing sense of a common history and future, if only because all of these controversies over heroes, monuments, texts, street names seem to have disappeared or at least gone back to the back burner. And finally, is there an ability to assimilate the other internally? It seems to me that the answer is a clear yes. Is there an ability to assimilate the external other? There, I think the answer is an increasing no, but that's good. So the picture is somewhat mixed, but I think in general, not bad. Thank you.
We'll move now to Adrian.
Great. I will probably not disagree with most of the points that Alex has made. Some of them I will make in a slightly different fashion, but I think we have fundamental agreement about where Ukraine stands, maybe a little bit of disagreement, but I will flip my discussion and begin with national identity and then turn to social cohesion, maybe a little bit for the sake of continuity, but also for the sake of priority. Because I believe that this is, Ukraine has been, as Alex has mentioned, bequeathed by events that were, into which it was thrust, the Maidan, the Euromaidan, and then Ruskaya Vesna, the Russian Spring, and then the Russian outright invasion, occupation, and annexation of Ukrainian territory. All of these factors created a degree of dynamism that have propelled Ukraine in the direction of greater national cohesion, and that is observable in public opinion. The relative degree of cohesion has been, in fact, strengthened by the occupation of parts of the territory in the sense that they are not participating in the political discourse, and therefore the voice of I would say, Ukrainian narrative is weaker in society, and the political forces representing it have less representation. So this last period of 6 years, although it is unfortunate and a threat and so on, and a terrible aggression, from the point of view of nation building, has created a better environment for creating more regional cohesion and regional consensus. Some of the statistics are even more dramatic than Alex has suggested. Almost 80% of people believe that the language, Ukrainian language, is an important definer of Ukrainian independence. There is an understanding, as the writer Serhiy Zhadan, who lives in eastern Kharkiv, said, the people who live in Kharkiv don't yet speak Ukrainian. Many of them have not learned Ukrainian well. Their children speak Ukrainian, but they don't speak it outside of school. But they are proud of Ukrainian, and the next generation, I am certain, will speak it. And I think this is the evolution that is occurring in many parts of Ukrainian territory, and it is attributable in part to very consistent longer-term trends in language policy, but those that really began in 2014, 2015, with a degree of substantial intensification of Ukrainianization. Volodymyr Kulik, the important sociologist in Ukraine, who is a frequent visiting scholar of the West and known to many Americans and Canadians, says, of course, there are sort of three attributes to define what linguistic identity is dominant in the country. It is the media, it is education, and it is what the language you speak at home. In terms of the language you speak at home today, about 50% of Ukrainians say that predominantly they speak Ukrainian at home. About 25% say they switch back and forth, and 25% are predominantly Russian speakers at home. But there's an important caveat in this. Because much of that 50% of exclusive Ukrainian speaking is in relatively impoverished and isolated rural Ukraine, in the urban setting where culture is shaped and the dominance of culture is defined, it is not yet so secure. And therefore, it's extremely important to have settled positions on the issue of continuing this linguistic politics, which, by the way, is supported by the vast majority of Ukrainians. For example, 44% of Ukrainians say that Ukraine should compel its citizens to respect its language, state symbols, and national traditions, whereas only 40% say it has to find a unifying ideology. So even when President Zelensky is speaking in more conditional terms about the attributes and finding a new identity for the independent Ukrainian state, there is a larger group of people that believe that in addition to searching for that identity, that search is over. We found that identity. It is in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian language, in Ukrainian heroes, and in the articulation of a historical narrative that increasing numbers are accepting. And another attribute of this is people's self-identification. You remember, today, over 90% of the people who live in Ukraine, even people of Russian or other ethnicities, will define themselves as Ukrainian because of an identification with the state, because of a generally positive predisposition. There's another interesting poll that shows attitudes. People were sort of told, if you were offered the opportunity to live in another country, and if you were offered, say, the opportunity to live in the United States, and you were given some money even a large amount of money to live in Russia. Like if you were offered $100,000 to relocate to Russia, only 24% of people in the Donbass and only 14% of the people in the East, not to speak of the West and the center where nobody supports this, only those proportions would be willing to relocate. That shows a substantial identification with the physical geography of the country, but also with this sense of Ukrainianness. And I think this is an important thing that has to be advanced, that shouldn't be put under question. And Mr. Zelensky has been sometimes vague, sometimes contradictory. The language laws and the media laws, which Mr. Zelensky today would be forced, not just as president, to speak Ukrainian, the media laws would compel his TV product, which was exclusively in Russian, to also speak, to produce content in Ukrainian. And there's been huge success in the changes that were implemented in media law, in education, and so on. So I think there's a lot of consolidation that has occurred, but the real worrying things are that factions in Mr. Zelensky's party are proposing reverse legislation. Of course, they're supported by the pro-Moscow media, which are gaining greater currency and presence in the discourse. There's really the latest news that Mr. Medvedchuk has bought a piece of Mr. Kolomoisky's 1+1 channel. Mr. Medvedchuk controls a number of 3 news channels out of the 6 in Ukraine, and he controls them primarily on his cash flow, which is partly based on favorable business, I would say, preferences that he and his wife have been given inside Russia. So this is a way of laundering Russian money, and that's something to be concerned about. And then there is Inter, again, which is pushing the line of maintaining dual, equal status for the Russian language, Russia as a state language, and so on. But because of the laws, Inter is doing this in Ukrainian, because 84% of the content of Inter today, a pro-Russian station, is currently in the Ukrainian language by law, and almost 100% of its news content is produced in Ukrainian. Now that doesn't mean that, and that's the case with almost all national broadcasters and most regional broadcasters. And the media laws had a quota that Ukrainian has to be in 75% plus. It escalated, it went from 50 to 60 to 75%. But most of the TV stations and most of those media are moving in the proper direction. There's also been but all of this was done, frankly, under the Poroshenko administration, and by inertia is continuing. And the worrying thing that I would add to this mix is the questions, the opening up of the discussion that Mr. Zelensky has. He's reopened these issues. He sort of said, do we have to compel to do certain things? Why don't we create incentives for the Ukrainian language? Why do we have to punish, et cetera, et cetera? There's also one contradictory thing in that Ukrainians are kind of lazy and they like their social media that they've been historically accustomed to. And they've lost their access to some of the Russian media unless they get VPN and bypass the restrictions on Russian, quote, news sites or Russian propaganda sites and Russian social media. But nevertheless, there is not a lot of resistance to the Ukrainianization of the television space, not to speak of radio, not to speak of the entertainment space, and so on. But there is the worrying thing that this issue continues to be under question. On the issue of identity and so on, there is a good appointment as the head of the Institute of National Memory. The person who is now in charge of Ministry of Culture, although he is close to Mr. Kolomoisky, he ran a TV station that had a predominantly Ukrainian audience and appealed to the center and west demographics in the battle for audience share. And so I think Mr. Tkachenko is also a pretty sophisticated, smart guy, and I think that's a relatively positive sign. So there's no regression on these issues. And in terms of identity, in terms of Western orientation, it's not just what country you want to live in that only 6% of Ukrainians would want to move to Russia if they had the opportunity, and only 11% if they were offered $100,000 plus the opportunity of a job and gainful employment in Russia. The orientation is reflected in high support for NATO. It's at probably about more than 50% of the population, I would say, when you tease out undecideds from people who would vote in a referendum, for example. And it is even higher for the sort of the EU integration. So that helps with the next topic, which I'll briefly deal with, which is social cohesion, which Alex dealt with quite well. I agree that generally people like Zelensky, even today when there is some discontent. There's a kind of a bifurcation now. They don't like the government in the same way they didn't past governments a year within their performance, even with the rotation of government. The government's negatives are, there's like 20% positive, 50% negative, or 25 to 60, but in the negative direction. But 49% of Ukrainians believe that Zelensky has been successful, and only 45% believe he's been unsuccessful in the first year of his presidency. But when you poll on specific issues about what has been accomplished and reducing the level of corruption among officials, only 28% say he's been successful and 70% say he's not. About criminal responsibility for the corrupt, 18% say he's been successful, 73% say not. And the regulation or the calming of the conflict of the war in the Donbass, only 21% say he's been successful and 69% not. And 21% say that he has successfully dealt with the economy and the economic crisis, and 65% say not. So there is now a gap between the ratings about his performance and the ratings of himself personally and in terms of his accomplishments. And I think there has been a decline in the overall popular assessment of him, and I believe it's growing to grow. Social cohesion, as Alex rightly pointed, has been given actually a bump because of COVID. The general view of, at least based on polls done in the last month, not this month, was that the government had coped well with COVID, although there's been, in recent days, a spike up and an increase in both fatalities and the number of people. So Ukraine has not flattened the curve. Ukraine is now on the upward curve, but it looked like it was flattening the curve when the polling data was done. So people gave decent scores. And more importantly, as of the end of April, Ukrainians were as optimistic as they are pessimistic. And if you know Ukrainian polling data, you know that Ukrainians are generally by a margin of 3 or 4 to 1 pessimistic or 5 to 1 pessimistic about where they are and where they are heading, as opposed to optimistic. So the Zelensky election still has some legs, and that has also created a bit of social cohesiveness. The sense that there is a president who is not siding with one of the the two polarities in Ukrainian political discourse, and that generally, I would say by Ukrainian standards, high levels of optimism mean that I think Ukraine is improving on the issues of social cohesion, at least for the moment. This can change very quickly, but we are tasked to make assessments of all these matters based on the current moment, with a snapshot that we're taking of Ukraine today. So going back to scores, how would I combine all of these trends and so on? I would say I would grade on a B- for the national identity issues, precisely because the president has articulated a less clear vision of what the last 6 years had almost brought to settlement in terms of the national discourse and national identity, and that could lead to, stagnation in the positive trends, and also some of the legislation that is being proffered that could undo education reforms and the television, I would say, quotas or requirements and so on, which are important in my view to promoting Ukrainian resilience in the face of Russian aggression. So a B- rather than a B or a B+ from last year. And on social cohesion, precisely because of the still fairly high ratings of the president as a unifying force, I would say that at this moment, and also the fairly high level of optimism that remains in Ukrainian society, and the satisfaction with the problems, with the dealing with the problems of COVID, I would give it a B+. But with one proviso, because it's not just grading, but my basic comment is there are storm clouds on the horizon. One is the decline in the economy began not because of COVID. There was a 2% decline in the first 2 months of the first full year of Zelensky's presidency and that of his government. There are serious problems with collecting the receipts and taxes. There'll be a big gap in government tax revenues because many people are not working. The government is going to try to squeeze the FOPs, the sort of individual self-employed, the gig economy writ large in Ukraine, of which there are about 2.5 million entities that are self-employed, and they're proposing to reduce their very low taxes to higher taxes. That'll create some resistance. And I do think that the longer the quarantine, which has now been extended because of the recent bump-up, the more the impact on the economy, and that could change things. But again, because we're assessing Ukraine, at the moment, I would say social cohesion is on the plus side. One last point. Social cohesion is different from the mobilization of the most, I would say, active portions of society. We have seen that, the politics of Kyiv, the city, the capital city, are not with Mr. Zelensky anymore. The country still is, but the politics of Kyiv have turned against him and his party. He is not as popular as he is in overall polls for the presidency, and his party is not as popular in Kyiv. And that is where civil strife and civil action emerge. Mr. Zelensky and his prosecutor general have undertaken a series of prosecutions of volunteers and civic activists and so on some of whom were involved in the defense of the Maidan and opened criminal cases alleging that they are engaged in something that led to the loss of life. And they're trying to treat every combatant in a fair and balanced way. The irony of that is that they are also, the problem is they're arresting and trying Ukrainian patriots, but they are releasing in prisoner exchanges the quislings and the traitors. So there is no balance. And they're also opening cases on the violence that had occurred over the fires in Odessa during the time of the Russian Spring. But again, not understanding the emotive impact of the fact that people went out to defend their country as volunteers, both in the military and against the Russian Spring, and here their government is criminalizing their activity. As I pointed out once to the prosecutor general, the new prosecutor general, who is a smart woman, Irina Venediktova, but has done some things that are questionable. If she were the attorney general at the American founding, Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson would all be under indictment today. So I'll conclude with my remarks with that point.
And now we'll turn to Mr. Ambassador.
There's nothing left to say. It's all been said by Alex and Adrian. I will still find a few things to contribute, though, I think. Like Professor Motyl, I'm also not assessing cohesion around identity or values issues in terms of are they cohering with my preferred vision, but rather are they contributing to an overall stability in the country? Are they able to form a plurality around a vision of Ukraine as a political nation that is broadly acceptable to diverse regional, ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups? I think it's been said before, but maybe just a slightly different take on it. As a projection screen candidate in the elections with only an implicit televisual program, and literally, Zelensky was uniquely well positioned to consolidate most, if not all, of the 73% of people who voted for him in round 2 of the elections. This was something his opponent Petro Poroshenko did not do, as he failed to pivot from his sort of base building Armia Mova Vira army language and faith identity focused initial campaign last year. The idea apparently had been to go to a more broadly inclusive, prosperity and future-oriented phase 2. Never happened. So when he ended up losing, in a way, his supporters then self-segregated into the 25%. I think those of us who spent too much time looking at Ukrainian social media will recall the actual 25% sort of labels going up on Poroshenko supporter portraits and profiles. So when we talk about undermining social cohesion, in a certain sense, it was the self-identification of the patriotic minority that was the first to sort of threaten some overall sense of cohesion. And the corollary of that was their belief that the remaining 3/4 of the population of Ukraine consisted of a sort of a Slavic version of deplorables. And again, you'll see our people, they are imbeciles, they failed to vote for the right candidate, how could they, etc. So where are they now? Well, some of them are in the streets today protesting the prosecution of President Poroshenko and feeling confirmed in their 25%ish beliefs. But I think as Adrian has pointed out, much of the sort of centrist 50% of the electorate, in other words, not the 25% who are militantly patriotic or the 25% who are aligned with pro-Russian or Soviet nostalgic parties, remain amorphously satisfied with Poroshenko because their own views are amorphous, or I'm influenced by the socially distanced presence of Mykola Ryabchuk here in Toronto over the past few months, and that is they are marked by their ambivalence in their thinking. And here I think I'll take a few of the stats that came out of that Kiev International Institute for Sociology study that Adrian was quoting, and maybe take a slightly different spin on them. So on the one hand, you have 55.5% of people who believe the country will mostly switch to operating Ukrainian. There's a certain teleological inevitability to it. But also then, on the other hand, and that's more than twice as many as believe that Russian should become a second official language, but then 48% feel that Russian is a historical asset for Ukraine and should be somehow fostered, maybe not with official language status, etc., but it's something that's in the cultural arsenal. 5-1, these people believe that Ukraine will prevail over Russia. It's Peremoha as opposed to Zrada in that sense. But also that 48 to 35% that peace in Donbass justifies talks with both Russia and the DNR-LNR. Now, you could say that means these people combine their belief in both political, military, and diplomatic sources of victory, but it makes managing a situation like that rather complex. And the 44 versus 40% views on imposing a national identity and creating some new unifying ideology. Those numbers, okay, there's 4% in there in favor of the existing national identity, but it's actually a rather uncomfortable balance. And then optimism and pessimism. You have slight advantage to optimists in terms of overall development versus declinists, but then a slight prevalence of people who believe unity is fraying as opposed to people who believe that unity is being strengthened. So I think I was in Ukraine from late 2014 to late 2019, and this post-Maidan push for crystallization of a national identity in accordance with a, I would say, decidedly Galician-inspired canon was starting to push some of the ambivalent group of Ukrainians out of their comfort zones. And they were initially silent because that was a moment of aggression. There was a kind of castle peace of Burgfrieden, as the Germans have put it, where everyone was kind of huddling together. But as time has gone on and as the intensity of the threat outside threat has dissipated, I think that group of people felt an empathetic cultural signal from Zelensky and his group. Sort of Ukrainian-ish, but not too Ukrainian, and respectful of the post-Soviet and Soviet cultural inheritance that they themselves felt a part of. Now that push had also aggravated national minority issues, sometimes inadvertently. The by now notorious Article 7 of the education law was in fact a formulation that popped up at the last minute on the floor of the parliament as they were voting on the law, and was not in fact what had originally been drafted by the Ministry of Education, and which then of course boomeranged in terms of especially the Hungarian issue, but then also other western border of Ukraine minority groups. Overall, despite this sense of inevitability of identity and linguistic consolidation, I think you need to be careful not to move too far too fast. And for this, ironically, I will go suddenly deep into century-old Galician past. And that is the Polish state's attempt at accelerated nation building, which was the education law, the so-called Lex Grabski, that sought to undo what they saw as Austrian Ukrainianization by promoting and imposing Polish language learning on Western Ukrainians, which in fact then ended up having the opposite effect and creating stress and strains. So I think the balance which the original draft of the education law had was probably right. Poroshenko government spent its last year trying to deal with the consequences of what had happened on the Rada floor. And now I think there are signs of détente on the Kyiv-Budapest relationship. So I think one of the positives that's been mentioned also that the Zelensky administration's willingness to dial down the temperature with Western neighbors, Hungary and Poland notably, and here there's been controversy in the recent weeks about the decision to create a fifth Transcarpathian rayon encompassing most ethnic Hungarians. A lot of concern. I actually think it's a fairly pragmatic solution that does not opt for overt autonomy while providing some territorial togetherness for this group. And no doubt that sort of move helped Ukraine obtain the enhanced opportunities partnership that Hungary would otherwise have vetoed, that was so much welcomed in the last panel session. And similarly, the new leadership at the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance has helped restart a more constructive dialogue with Polish historians and the Polish state on memory issues there, even though that's obviously problematic because of the situation in Poland itself with national memory. We had the sort of 6-month dalliance of Zelensky with new and Maidan-oriented faces, now reverted to the ambivalence of both his oligarchic enablers, who can switch between pro-Western and pro-Russian alliances depending on their material interests, and of his core voters, who both want a European standard of living now, but with no disruption of ingrained post-Soviet habits. So it's sort of making a European Ukraine safe for Slovaks is sort of where that targeting has to happen. The problem in managing all of this is, I think, as Andres Oslin noted yesterday, there is no clearly stated reform strategy in any field. I mean, if the old saying is culture eats strategy for lunch, well, the culture here can't even find an hors d'oeuvre really to munch on, and therefore the sort of post-Soviet culture of Reshalovo, of solutions through administrative interference, is making a comeback, just because there is actually no articulated strategy of longer term reforms, which I think Zelensky himself and a bunch of his team find boring. You got a 5-year plan for transforming education. You got a 5-year plan for transforming healthcare. Boring. Fix the clinic in the village now. And that has actually ironically enabled a comeback by the people who led to the current sad situation we face. So the sort of policy log rolling of you have a kind of articulate or a very determined Portnov, who then programs investigators and prosecutors to go after people of the Poroshenko period. Sure, go crazy. You have Kuleba and a new technocratic EU deputy prime minister who want to do Euro-Atlantic things. Sure, but it is all happening in these pockets of determination are happening amid a very mushy overall picture. And if I were to advise Zelensky, it would be, yes, be centrist, but be strategically centrist. Don't be spinelessly or amorphously centrist. And I would say that the biggest threat to his log rolling at the moment is the clearly articulated moves from the ex-Yanukovych pro-Russia constituency, the prosecutions happening now. There's sort of a Hail Mary pass also in terms of popularity. The other KIIS stat that is very relevant there is that Poroshenko is pretty much detested by 58% of Ukrainians, who believes he has stolen them blind. Personally, it's kind of like the Grinch coming in and removing things from their hearth, whereas Medvedchuk is seen as a threat by only about a third. So therefore, when people ask the question, why is he going after Poroshenko and not Medvedchuk? Quite apart from the Kolomoisky and Portnov revenge factor, it's also the what would play with the public factor that's there. So I see this as potentially very damaging and mood altering. So I'm not sure. I think we were asked to hold off on our grading until the very end. I would say that for me, Ukraine now is kind of a bit of a snakes and ladders board, that you can actually make it to a certain number, but then there's a danger of sliding down rather quickly.
I've noted that when there have been comments about the slow pace of change in Ukraine, so much of that has to do with the people that are at the top in the bureaucracy. Certainly with the notable exception of everybody that's involved in this conference, when people get to be 50 and 60 and 70 years old, their brain is kind of hardwired on some concepts. And if those concepts were compatible with reality, that's not a bad thing. If you understand how an economy works, how democracy works, that's not a bad thing. But if your mind is formed by Soviet education, by the time of the USSR, by the knowledge that if you get into the bureaucracy, of course, the natural thing to do is to steal, that's not going to change. What's going to change and what's going to bring cohesion to Ukraine is a generational march to the institutions. And to that end, I note with satisfaction that every year you have more people, as Adrian pointed out, that are comfortable with the Ukrainian language. You have more people that have a friend or they themselves have traveled or worked in the West, and they understand what a modern economic system is and what it means for the life of individual citizens. You have more people that have the shared history as they come of age of Russia as an enemy, as opposed to a more fraternal relationship that was prevalent in many places before Donbass, before Crimea, and so forth. So I'm optimistic that the generational march will solve a lot of problems, but I think we have to be reconciled to the fact that it's going to take some time. Now we're going to go to some questions. Walter would like, my cue just disappeared from the screen. Whoever put it up there, put it back. Walter wanted the ambassador to expound on something, but I don't know what it was.
We can ask directly, Walter.
I've seen. I see the question in the chat.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it was in the chat. I see.
Principled centrism. What would this mean? I think it does mean articulating a more extensive pan-regional vision of the country. I think it means validating identities of different parts of the country. I mean, and here I'll give you a slightly peculiar observation, which comes from a cookbook. Many of you have seen it. It's Ola Hercules and Mamushka. If any of you have leafed through that book, and it's an excellent example of Ukrainian food porn for the West, you'll see that the Ukraine she depicts is a kind of southern Mediterranean Ukraine that is not part of the dumpling Ukraine that many of us have grown up with, either directly or indirectly. And I think sort of finding ways of articulating values for every part of the country that brings out the best in them in a more systematic fashion. And I think it also means, though, something that they have avoided, and it was mentioned yesterday in terms of economic policy, but it's generally true, and that is policy coordination. If you're approaching the Donbass, you know, there was this Serhiy Sivokho platform for dialogue that derailed so badly with the Kvartal comedian, you know, and many people derided that. I think actually as a final portion of a public diplomacy outreach, using people like that to speak to disaffected populations is good and could be useful, but only if you actually have the policy base in the first place. I think Daniluk, in his brief tenure at the National Security and Defense Council, was intending to create that sort of policy coordination role where you could then even go out on a bit of a limb, but knowing where your sort of policy keel lies. And that, I think, is where they need to define something, almost anything, as opposed to simply reacting to internal and outside stimuli.
I have to, I see faint echoes of multiculturalism and bilingualism in the distinguished Canadian ambassador's view of Ukraine's future, and I think it's extremely dangerous and should not be the path Ukraine should move on, simply because there is someone like Vladimir Putin who believes that one of the bilingual choices allows him the right to intercede in defense of the people who speak that language. And the promotion of the language allows the Russian state to continue through soft power to penetrate the Ukrainian state. Therefore, I personally believe that because there is a war, there is a national security argument to be made to the Ukrainian people about, yes, we know you have this problem, we know you have this legacy, but 90% of you say you are Ukrainians. Therefore, it is incumbent on you to become more resilient in the face of this Russian threat and to move to the more deep embrace of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian civilization, and the Ukrainian language. So I would say that is the way that a centrist approach, yes, mindful of the fact that you speak to people in the East about their assumptions and about some of their heroes, you do it as a sort of a, not in a paternalistic way, but in a way that is open to dialogue. But in the end, there has to be a firm understanding of what the endpoint is. And the endpoint is Het vid Moskvy.
Herman, do you want to respond before we go to the last question and grading?
No, I think I can see Adrian's point, but I think that you need to know that in pursuing policies like this, you don't promote more of a counteraction than you are promoting agreement with yourself. I think we saw again in the last couple of days a rather talented demagogue, Mr. Shadi, and his party picking up on what was actually a long-established McDonald's Ukraine policy of serving people in Ukrainian, first and foremost, and kicking up a fuss about it, which then activated some of the base, which couldn't be activated by the sort of boring old pro-Moscow constituency, but could be by someone who's sort of new media and talks about culture through the prism of McDonald's. So you don't want to, I mean, I am firmly in favor of the McDonald's linguistic policy across the country. Don't get me wrong on that. But you don't want to give people like that unnecessary bait and clickbait.
Okay, last question for everybody that wants to chime in. What differences do you see in relationships between Kharkiv and Donbass with places like Lviv and Galicia, the Carpathian regions? How has that evolved over the past decade?
Sure. I would say here the conflict has been actually helpful. It's created a sort of forced mobility within Ukraine, partly through internal displacement, which is tragic. But it means people have been bumping up against each other and learning more about each other. Plus the soldiers going into the east, plus the volunteer movement. There's been much more intra-Ukrainian contact than there was over previous decades. Certainly, one of the things we then incorporated into our projects was to not necessarily take people to Europe or Canada, but simply to take them to a kind of best practice other Ukrainian location to look at stuff because they found it much more convincing.
Adrian?
The other issue here, which could be a unifying factor, is the resistance of mayors to the attempts to re-centralize authority and budget. And now there's an effort underfoot to create a party of mayors led by the mayor of Dnipro, which is a sort of east central city, that could be another point where it's, you know, we may not have the same historical heroes, but we certainly have the same common agenda to preserve as much authority and right from local government. So I think the politics sometimes, I mean, that doesn't answer the question of a centrist approach, but I do think that will create greater, interregional cooperation, especially if this party of mayors congeals as it appears to be doing in the face of this centralization.
Alexander, can you give your comments and then you can give your grade too?
The comment I would make, less in response to the questions, but just in general, is that we should be wary of offering or suggesting that Ukraine, or for that matter any other country, adopt some template that we are certain works. Because of course, I can't think of any particular template that works. I was just looking at those 4 questions that Walter raised. If we apply them to the United States today, the United States would probably get G's or F's on all 4 questions. If we ask those questions of Canada, say 2 decades ago during the controversy regarding the Québécois, then too, it's conceivable that Canada would have gotten failing grades. We talk about the necessity of rapid reform, and I say this as someone who for 30 years has been arguing that the only good reform is slow reform. Then, you know, we look at Poland and Hungary, which reformed very rapidly and which were on the forefront of countries that seem to be doing extremely well. And now they seem to be the worst possible laggards, reversing all these decades of remarkable changes. I could point to France, I could point to Germany, I could point to Italy, I could point to the United Kingdom and many other countries as well. Anyway, I think that it needs to foster a certain sense of humility in all of us. But what does this mean for Ukraine? What this means for Ukraine is that good enough is really very good. And we shouldn't be expecting Ukraine to meet non-existent standards or unrealistic standards. I forget who said this in the former panel. it should be making steady progress. And if the zigs or the zags that it occasionally engages, or if the step backward that it occasionally engages in isn't too large, that's still not too bad. Now, that doesn't mean that I think Zelensky is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But thus far, he hasn't quite yet proven the disaster that I, for one, thought he would be. In some instances, he does approach that. But so far, well, maybe not so good, but not too terribly bad, which is probably good enough. Anyway, so in terms of my grades, I'm not sure how to grade them because is an A, B, C, D equal to the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1?
Yes.
So unchanged 3 is a C?
Yes.
Okay, this just militates against my inclination to inflate grades at the university.
It's stagnation. It's
Well, if that's the case, then I would give Ukraine a C plus, B minus, let's give it a B minus on social cohesion, and probably a B on national identity.
Okay.
Do that only because of the COVID business, and I understand. I mean, if it weren't for COVID and its impact on the economy and unemployment, I'd probably give Ukraine a B in both categories.
Okay. I think Adrian has given his unless he wants to change. So we'll go to Roman.
B plus for social cohesion, because we're discussing the snapshot of the country right now and not trying to project what COVID or the economic crisis will result in. Currently, we're in this zone. Next year it could be different. And a B minus because of the uncertainty in the more settled policies on language, culture, and education that have intruded into the president's rhetoric.
Okay. Roman?
I would say I'd give it an overall B minus, but in snakes and ladders terms, if too much persecution of previous regime people occurs, you could quickly slip to a D.
Okay. I'm a B minus on both, and that concludes the panel. Walter, it's back to you.
again, the discussion, especially that sort of a debate that the ambassador and Adrian engaged in. I was going to include Alexander into that and Herman as well. These were 4 aces. I can't begin to thank you for having taken part in it. You really have, and you've raised the level, and we have 2 more guests waiting in the wings.